Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We've got a matched pair of economists for you today to help us think about why we're grinding through the seventh year of our so-called recovery. For the second half of our show, it's off to Washington, D.C. to meet with Vernon Smith, winner of the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics and the 2015 recipient of the Julian Simon Award. Up first, we're pleased to welcome my favorite contrarian, James Grant, editor of Grant's Interest Rate Observer and author of the recently released book, The Forgotten Depression of 1921, The Crash That Cured Itself. Jim, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It was nice to be here.
Jim, you open your book with a very famous quote that I'm going to read to set the stage and ask you to comment on. And here it is. In the economy, an act, a habit, an institution, a law gives birth not only to an effect, but to a series of effects. Of these effects, the first only is immediate. It manifests itself simultaneously with its cause. It is seen. The others unfold in succession. They are not seen. It is well for us if they are foreseen. Frederick Bastiat, 1850.
Oh, isn't that lovely?
Why are we forever relearning this lesson?
This reminds me a little bit of the weatherman. In the Northeast, at the end of January, especially in New York City, there was forecast the greatest snowstorm since the arrival of the Dutch 300 years earlier. And the scientifically empowered weather forecasters promised us, foot upon foot upon foot of a brilliant blizzard. And wouldn't you know it, it didn't happen. And I got to thinking that we ought to be able to forecast blizzards. After all, snowflakes are inanimate. They don't respond to stimuli from the Federal Reserve or from the U.S. Treasury. They don't troll the World Wide Web and get thoughts put into their little minds. We have hundreds of thousands of observations, perhaps, which we can crunch with big data about how weather patterns change. And yet the weathermen, objective scientists, simply missed it. So what Bastiat is saying is that human action is full of consequences, some of which perhaps we can know, but many of which we cannot know or even imagine. And those lovely words are a constant and, I think, eternal warning to the conceit of our policymakers that they can institute action and foresee the reverberating consequences of those actions over time.
Well, you tell that story in your book. And the crash of 1920-21, you state, was the 14th business cycle contraction since the Panic of 1812, and you call it America's last governmentally unmedicated depression. Why didn't the federal government act then and in all those earlier downturns?
So much of what we think about the economy today is recently invented. For example, the very words, the economy. Those words are newly entered into the vocabulary of public policy. Not until the 30s or the 40s did the very concept of a macroeconomy enter our vocabulary. When people in the 1920s talked about economy, they were talking about frugality, they were talking about prudence. Nobody was imagining a national organism of enterprise such that could be measured, such that might be controlled from Washington, D.C. The people certainly knew about prosperity, they knew about depression, they knew about booms and bust. What they didn't believe was that government action could control a cycle of business activity. In World War I, there had been a great deal of government intervention. The government tried to mobilize all actors in the American enterprise, labor and management. Yeah, the goal of military victory. Come the peace, there was a general consensus that individuals ought to be allowed to get back to the business of maximizing their own idea of profit. So there was no real attempt to control the cycle.
So how bad was the inflationary spiral after World War I?
The consumer price index was rising at double digits from the middle of the Great War in Europe through 1919. Terrific inflation. And, inflations not only raise up average prices, but they also institute signals or invitations for people to do what will turn out to be the wrong thing if prices are like traffic signals in a market economy.
But what sorts of economic malinvestments occurred during this spiral?
Well, there are a couple that come to mind. One is The General Motors Corporation, even then a great American blue chip and behemoth, built itself the biggest headquarters building in the world in Detroit. Acre upon acre of new office space, all for a cost of $20 million. This is an expectation that the inflationary boom would continue. And then in Kansas City, Missouri, a couple of veterans of the Great War, Harry Truman and his business partner, set up a haberdashery, which they financed with a lot of bank credit. And innumerable farmers bought more land or bought newfangled tractors, some of which they did on credit. Altogether, there was a great expansion of activity, much of which was financed with debt.
And it must have felt good at the time.
Oh, it felt great. Nothing like a boom.
What role did the new Federal Reserve Act play?
The Fed came into being in 1914, just in time to help finance World War I. And it did this by suppressing interest rates and by helping the government to issue its debt. We call them bonds, these instruments of indebtedness. Hundreds of millions and indeed billions upon billions of new debt the Federal Reserve facilitated through its policy of interest rate suppression.
So things got pretty ugly in the aftermath of the war. Your book indicates that 1 in 5 American workers were involved in a strike in 1919. The Bolshevik Revolution had electrified the American left. The progressives were on the march. Terror bombings on Wall Street killed 38 people. Of course, the flu pandemic had just killed 675,000 Americans, and there were race riots in many major cities. As the 1920s came about, how close did the country come to collapse?
Well, the country never collapsed, never came close to it. But a British economist, Thomas Gregory, T.E. Gregory, took the measure of the world's troubles, and he said, not since the collapse of Rome has the world come so close to disintegration. So this was not to be confused with the era of good feelings.
Woodrow Wilson looms large in the history of those times. What was the context in which he said, I am perfectly sure that the state has got to control everything that everybody needs and uses?
He was musing to guests at the White House at the time. It was a president who had been thoroughly involved in wartime mobilization and in the virtual nationalization of many basic American industries, pondering the progressive future. But you know, the great irony of this governmentally unmedicated depression, this business cycle downturn in which the government stood by and really did nothing, as we today would think of it. The irony was that Woodrow Wilson did nothing because he was not intellectually incapacitated or intellectually converted to the doctrine of laissez-faire, but he was physically incapacitated, as every high school senior will remember. He suffered a stroke while campaigning for the League of Nations in 1919, I think. So his White House was silent, and he was on his back, and his administration was likewise laid low.
Turned out that worked out pretty well.
Well, not for him, but for the country.
When the market broke in the ensuing downturn, how bad did things get? And by that I mean, what happened to unemployment, industrial production, the stock market, corporate profits, the usual economic indicators?
It was a scene of terrific loss and terrific upset and turmoil and discouragement. Stock market almost saw it in half. Commodity prices plunged. They were the angle of descent of this collapse in commodity prices had never before been seen, and never has been seen since, not even during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Industrial production down, if memory serves, more than 25% from top to bottom. They did not measure unemployment then, but it was surely in the double digits. Altogether, a very, very severe business cycle downturn.
Did any banks fail?
Some did, but the ones that failed were very small. Some wobbled. Some of the big New York institutions had difficulty, but interestingly enough, not a single major bank failed.
So what was the mood of the people at the time?
The country then was, to a great extent, still agricultural. It wasn't the dominant business, farming. But everyone either farmed or knew someone who did. And the collapse in the agricultural economy was even more severe, even more scary than that of the industrial economy.
So, Jim, you paint a pretty dire picture of where the economy stood in 1921. Warren Harding became president in a landslide victory over the progressives. What did he do to fix the broken economy?
What he did most effectively was nothing. Although that really underplays a little of what he accomplished. Harding got into the White House famously on the promise of a return to normalcy, by which he meant a return to pre-World War I conditions. That return never actually occurred. Much as people desired the apparent peace and innocence of the year 1913, it was never recaptured.
Mm-hmm.
What Harding did achieve was to revitalize the country with a sense of confidence in the institution of enterprise and in the hope for prosperity. He did this through tangible means as well as psychological means. He said, okay, what we're going to do is to get the federal finances in order. We are going to reduce taxes, reduce the burdens on business, more business in government, less government in business. That was the plan. And his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, was one of the great entrepreneurs, one of the great capitalists of that era.
What role did he play in policy development?
Mellon played an instrumental role in policy. He agitated for a Hamiltonian program of taxes. His great hero was Alexander Hamilton, meaning lower marginal tax rates for all, including business. And he also pressed for lower interest rates. The Fed had by then jacked them up to the sky. And Mellon wanted lower rates. And someone said to him, well, if the Fed cuts rates, there'll be speculation. And Mellon said, well, I think the country could use a little speculation.
What would have economists at the time have thought of so-called quantitative easing?
I think they would have had difficulty conceiving the notion of it. The world then was in a very different monetary regime. Today, the value of money is indeterminate. Certainly, the money we have is undefined. It is a slip of paper or an item in the cloud, a digital blip. A dollar is a dollar. Then a dollar was kind of 1/20th of an ounce of gold. It was something objective.
And quite a few gold coins were actually in circulation.
Yes, although during World War I, the government had instituted a program to economize on gold and take them out of circulation. It wasn't exactly a true gold standard in the sense that gold served as hand-to-hand currency and entered and left the country freely, but it was a virtual gold standard. Certainly the dollar was still objectively defined as a weight of gold.
When did the recovery actually start, and what did it look like?
Well, things stopped getting worse in the summer of 1921. The stock market scraped bottom, and cautiously optimistic items began appearing in the Wall Street Journal. The recovery was something that our politicians today can only dream about. It began quickly, it began dynamically, and by the end of 1921, this is 18 months after 18 months of officially timed depression.
Which is nothing.
Well, it was plenty for those who suffered through it, but by our lights today, suffering as we are through 7 years of kind of a sleepwalk, it was brief in the extreme. But by the end of 1921, there were labor shortages in Detroit.
And what happened to prices and wages? Did they make an entire round trip through the inflation and the subsequent deflation and come back to where they started?
Not exactly. Prices were up what we might call, in a precise MIT way, Bill, they were up a ton during the inflation. They pulled back to a great degree. They pulled back. Certainly commodity prices were down, call them 40%. Stock prices down 45 or 50. Wages, importantly, fell as well. They didn't fall so far as prices, but they did decline. And because wages declined to a degree, business people were able to restore profitability at a lower level of prices.
There was still enough wage flexibility back then because I guess people hadn't been locked into large union contracts?
The country was, in fact, heavily unionized, but there was no social safety net. And people kind of had to take work as it was offered. It was available to them. People did save, but it was not a question of living off unemployment insurance for a year and then having that unemployment insurance renewed for another half year or a year, waiting for the right job at the right wage. People took such wages as they could.
So did this moderate union demands and allow flexibility?
I think it did, yes.
And what happened to labor relations rolling into 21, 22, 23?
Well, labor relations were poisonous coming out of the war. coal miners, for example, had been enjoined for patriotic reasons to demand no unreasonable wage increase, and they found their real wages, their inflation-adjusted pay, down substantially. So, come the peace, what they wanted was catch-up, and that was not forthcoming. Samuel Gompers, the head of the American Federation of Labor, was insistent that there would be no wage reductions during what turned out to be the Depression. And he was disappointed in that, but there were strikes upon strikes, as you mentioned earlier, when Wilson was touring the country trying to drum up support for his League of Nations. His train was sometimes slowed or delayed because of labor troubles. So it's a most unhappy and indeed poisonous time for labor management relations.
And then how did that change as we went into the mid-20s?
Well, nothing like prosperity for sweetening tempers.
Well, it's funny, like most Americans, until I picked up your book, I didn't even realize we had a depression in 1920-21. I think of that as the Roaring Twenties.
Well, they did roar, and they roared, I think, in part because of the rationalization of prices and wages that this depression brought about. The depression was severe, and for many people it was a blight, but it was not pointless. The inflation had distorted things considerably. Banks had lent to the wrong entrepreneurs against the wrong collateral at the wrong rate of interest because of inflation. Inflation puts you in a kind of a economic funhouse, I guess a house of mirrors, and the images you see looking back are distorted. So the Depression, insofar as it was a constructive force, helped to restore prices and wages to something much more closely resembling objective fact as opposed to inflationary distortion.
Well, Jim, what lessons did we learn from that last unmedicated depression?
Not a damn one.
That was quick.
I'm looking around today at the lay of the land, and what we have is, instead of the wisdom to let economic nature take its course, what we have is a massive medical intervention, and by now is a very tired body economic. We have a Federal Reserve that is pushing on the scale of prices and wages with its big fat thumb. We have an insatiable federal government that is spending and taxing. And I think most malignantly of all, we have the Dodd-Frank Act, which has, and I use this term advisedly, which has instituted the nationalization of the biggest banks in the country.
Well, before we get to the precipice we stand on, most Americans were raised believing that the Depression of 1929 was cured by FDR's New Deal and all his economic intervention. Why do we believe that?
I put this down to the paucity of sales of my book.
No, seriously. I mean, everyone who's gone through grade school and most colleges teach that.
Well, it is the narrative, and it's the narrative that was spun out during our own Great Recession. We were told that unless the government took massive remedial action, we would all be back in the soup of the 1930s. There is, I think, a more persuasive narrative, and that is that far from adopting the lessons of 1920-21, which lessons feature the downward flexibility of wages in the interest of restoring ultimate prosperity, then President Hoover got on the radio and got in front of audiences and said, this time there will be no pullback in wages. He was playing to the galleries, and I think noblesse oblige, taking the stance that industrialists ought to
take it in the chin,
first.
Right?
Yeah,
and they did.
They did indeed, and the result was mass unemployment.
And it took until controls of the economy were lifted after World War II for the real economy to start growing again.
Yes. People think the Depression ended in 1933, and by the lights of the National Bureau of Economic Research, that was the ending point. But I think a good case can be made, to which you just alluded, that it wasn't until 1946 that enterprise, as opposed to government, really predominated in American effort. And it wasn't until then that we truly escaped from the 1930s.
Well, thanks to all the medication the Federal Reserve has been applying since the 2008 market collapse, we really do seem to be poised at the precipice again. What do you see for America ahead?
Well, I have come to see in the fullness of my years that America is absolutely indestructible. It's like Major League Baseball. Try as they might, and they do try, they really can't destroy it. So I am, as a father of four and a small caliber entrepreneur, I suppose I am, and despite my reputation, well-founded for being bearish on certain things, I am basically an optimist on the American proposition, the American experiment, and I think I would not choose the word precipice. I think that we, in fact, have got ourselves into a very big economic problem by dint of this nonstop so-called unstimulating stimulus. But I look forward to the restoration of the primacy of what Adam Smith called the invisible hand and what Friedrich Hayek called the price mechanism. I look forward to the restoration of enterprise and capitalism. And it's nothing that an election or two couldn't help to bring about. So I think that we are going to be okay, although I think that the immediate danger we face is the danger that our forebears confronted in 1920, which was a financial landscape distorted through the manipulation of interest rates being so key in how we think about cash flows and future profitability.
The most important price.
Yeah.
So, Jim, you remain optimistic, but what advice do you give individual Americans to weather the likely adjustment storm ahead?
I take as my investment motto the following. Successful investing is about having everyone agree with you later. So what is wanted always is to think about the non-intuitive thing, the contrary thing, and you imagine that the future will repay enterprising and imaginative thought. If we're as simple as being with consensus, we'd all be much richer than we are. So with that prelude, the least repaying asset extant today is cash, yielding as it does nothing. But cash affords you flexibility in the future. And if those of us who think that we are currently in a kind of a never land of valuation, if we're correct, that will mean the sorting out of things in the fullness of time, which means lower prices, distress, and opportunity.
Right.
So I think that the main thing is patience, lots of cash, lots of courage, and the belief that this too shall pass. By this, I mean our current PhD standard of manipulation by former tenured academics, faculty of our leading institutions that are running the Federal Reserve.
Well, Jim, I hope you're right, since I've been in the mattress since Cyprus. Thanks so much for being on the show.
You're welcome, Bill. Nice to talk to you.
That was James Grant from Grant's Interest Rate Observer here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Please check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by RealClearRadio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, it's off to the belly of the beast to meet with Vernon Smith, 2002 winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, getting ready to party in Washington. Stay tuned.